Hello, today I'm really excited to talk to you about this exciting book, Jane Crow, The Life of Pauli Murray, written by Rosalind Rosenberg. It's actually going to be a combo of a book review and profile in American history. So here is a little review. At last, the full story of one of the greatest trailblazers of the 20th century. No one did more than the mixed-race, transsexual writer, lawyer, activist, and priest Pauli Murray to advance the cause of human rights in her time. Murray spent her life arguing that race, gender, and economic inequality are interconnected and devising strategies for battling all forms of discrimination. So I absolutely loved this book. I was engaged the entire time, didn't want to put it down. I'm excited to talk to you about what's inside this book and about Pauli Murray. The author, Rosalind Rosenberg, is a professor at Barnard College, and for her very first book, Beyond Separate Spheres, she was the winner of the Frederick Jackson Turner Prize. She specializes in women's social and legal history. Was Pauli Murray an activist, lawyer, poet, professor, and priest? So she was born in 1910 and lived until 1985. She was actually born as Anna Pauline, but eventually changed her name to Pauli, or went by Pauli, really. At age 3, she was orphaned, and so then she went to live with her aunt and grandparents. And it was really her aunt's influence on her that allowed her to transcend some boundaries, which we'll talk about in a little bit. She has a racial heritage that's European, African, and American Indian. And she was in the poor working class her entire life. And in the early years, actually throughout her entire life, education was an essential component, and fought to attend various schools, faced rejections based on her race and her gender multiple times. One of the things that Pauli Murray is known for is that her today should be identified as transgender. Likely she would have chosen that term and would have chosen alternative pronouns for herself. However, as Rosenberg describes in the introduction of her book, going by alternative pronouns was not available to her in those years. It's only in more recent history that we have engaged in that identification. And so Rosenberg really wrestled with this idea of whether to identify Murray with gender-neutral pronouns or male pronouns. And ultimately, she landed on still calling her by female pronouns because that's what was in the time period. So she definitely identified with an in-betweenness in many ways, an in-betweenness with her race and her gender. In the 1930s, she did seek medical assistance, trying to find an anatomical reason for the crisis that she was facing. And tried to find someone to provide her with hormone therapy. A lot of these things were not available at the time. But eventually she came to see her troubles as strengths, qualities that allowed her to understand gender and race not as fixed categories, but unreasonable classifications. So really not living in a binary world, but finding that there's more of a spectrum in lots of areas of life. One of the things that she is most known for is the term Jane Crow, which is where the title of the book comes in. And it's a parallel drawn to Jim Crow. And Jim Crow is the reference to racism and segregation that was occurring. And so here's a quote from the book. In coining the term Jane Crow in the early 1940s, Murray had meant not only to emphasize the parallel nature of race and gender discrimination, but also convey the compounding effects of gender plus race discrimination for women of color. So this topic of intersectionality is something that we hear about more often today, but it was new in the 1940s, the idea of sexual discrimination and the combination of these two types of discrimination, and then adding in class as well with poverty. Some legal contribution of Murray. She was incredibly influential on some really important names. So it's shocking to me that her name, that Pauli Murray, is not more well known because of her influence on people like Thurgood Marshall, Betty Friedan, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Eleanor Roosevelt. So it was really her theories regarding using the 14th Amendment to combat discrimination that Thurgood Marshall ended up using in Brown versus Board of Education to desegregate schools. She also was extremely influential on persuading Betty Friedan to create the National Organization for Women, which eventually Murray did walk away from because of the issues of racism within the organization. She felt that it really became an organization centered on the issues for white women versus all women. And then her concept of Jane Crow really propelled Ruth Bader Ginsburg to her first Supreme Court victory in Reed versus Reed. So what I have here is an image where you can see is the brief where Ruth Bader Ginsburg is listed. And Pauli Murray is also listed. Now, Pauli Murray did not argue this case, but it was her work. Ginsburg believed her work was so influential that she still listed her on the brief. So this book, there's sections of the book, and I'd like to just talk through a few of them. So coming of age, her early years is really that biographical section describing her family history, early issues with gender identity, and first encounters with racism, and a lot about her education. So I believe this takes us all the way through her undergraduate. And then confronting Jim Crow is where she begins her activism, where she begins to actually fight against racism. She really begins with racism and moves to gender later on. She engages in a bus protest that lands her in jail and starts a nonviolent response to that. She engages in marches and sit-ins, one of which was successful. And it does talk about those initial influences on Thurgood Marshall and Eleanor Roosevelt. The next section is really centered on Jane Crow. So the idea of feminism, the idea of sexual discrimination. And this is where she really is going to more identify as a feminist. And she moves to California, where she's involved in some civil rights activism regarding housing and employment. Moving on is the fourth section, where is a lot of it is centered on her struggles with an early law career and some success as an author. This is where she meets her lifelong partner, Renee Barlow, and she does end up moving to Africa temporarily to be a professor there. The next section is about her doctoral degree at Yale, the ability to be part of a presidential commission on the status of women, her engagement in other organizations like the ACLU and NOW, and really a debate with other women about strategies for women to obtain equal rights or to maintain the protections that had been put in place by the law already. And then finally, the last section is her career as a professor. So her teaching, her struggles to be a woman of color in the professorship, trying to obtain tenure, implementing new courses on African American studies as well as women's studies. And then she really has a complete shift and goes to seminary and eventually becomes a priest in the Episcopalian Church. And so that last section is kind of the final ending of her life, where she landed and what kind of legacy she wanted to leave behind. So in regards to that legacy, her name is not well known, but the people who were inspired by her works are Thurgood Marshall, Eleanor Roosevelt, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Betty Friedan. They all were heavily influenced by her. The term Jane Crow, again, not as well known as Jim Crow, but those ideas led to this development of the idea of intersectionality. She said that race and gender discrimination, as well as poverty, must be considered as oppressions that are interconnected. So really beginning that conversation that is much more prominent today. Contributions of this book. It is a thorough biography. As you can tell, it's thick, of a little known but exceptional figure in American history. Clearly demonstrates the influence of Murray upon movements with race and gender. It is extremely readable while also being complex. Murray's life was complex. She faced a lot of crises, a lot of times where her life was less than remarkable, which makes her incredibly relatable. And so it not only talks about those complexities and her continued struggle, but also how she maintained a persistence to change her environment, not to accept the status quo. So we're going to end with just two short quotes by Pauli Murray. One person plus one typewriter constitutes a movement. She was an incredible writer and left a wealth of documentation for Rosenberg to end up going through when she was attempting her biography. And finally, what is often called exceptional ability is nothing more than persistent endeavor. So I hope you enjoyed learning a little bit more about Pauli Murray. I hope that you go check out this book, Jane Crow. Like I said, it was a great read, one of my favorites from this year.